100-mile fastballs pitched to you today. You hitting any of them out?
That's easy. I don't care how hard you throw a baseball. If there's a catcher behind home plate.
Jeff Bagwell knew something about Barry Bonds that baseball did not want to admit. In 2001, pitchers stood on the mound and simply refused to throw him a fair pitch. He hit 73 home runs that year, a number nobody had ever reached before, and teams still chose to walk him rather than risk it. 3 years later, he reached base more than 6 times in every 10 trips to the plate, a record that still stands today. Most people looked at those numbers and saw a scandal. Jeff Bagwell looked at the same numbers and saw something else. He saw a hitter whose mind worked faster than any pitcher could plan for, operating inside a system that had built the conditions for exactly this kind of explosion. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. And if a story like this deserves a second look, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because what Bagwell understood does not just explain Barry Bonds, it changes the whole debate about the era both men played in. Bagwell was not a bitter rival trying to explain away a threat to his own legacy. He was one of the few men in the sport who had lived close enough to elite hitting to actually judge it. For years, the conversation about Bonds started and ended with his body. People pointed at his size, his numbers, and the timeline of his career, and decided the story was simple. A talented player took shortcuts and became something artificial. Bagwell never accepted that framing. He believed the debate had become shallow, focused entirely on what might have changed about Bonds physically, while ignoring what had always existed in his eyes, his instincts, and his understanding of the men trying to get him out. This video is going to walk through why Bagwell was right, using nothing but the record both players actually built on the field, season by season, and the system that surrounded them both. Both men came from a golden generation of hitters. The 1989 draft produced 5 future Hall of Famers, including Frank Thomas, Jim Thome, Jeff Kent, and Trevor Hoffman. Bagwell was part of that class too, taken by his hometown Boston Red Sox in the 4th round. Boston sent him to Houston in 1990 in a trade that is still talked about as one of the most lopsided in baseball history. When he arrived, the Astros already had Ken Caminiti locked in at third base, so manager Art Howe moved Bagwell to first. That simple positional switch put him on a path toward becoming one of the most feared right-handed hitters of his generation, and it started a close friendship with Caminiti that would later place both men near the center of the steroid era. Bonds arrived with a completely different kind of pressure. His father, Bobby Bonds, had been a major league star, and his godfather was Willie Mays, so expectations followed him before he ever put on a professional uniform. At Arizona State, he hit .347 with 45 home runs, numbers that should have made him universally beloved on campus. Instead, his college coach described him as self-centered, and that same reputation followed him into the majors. Bonds developed a hostile, guarded relationship with reporters almost from the start, and that relationship with the press would matter enormously later, when the public had to decide how much sympathy he deserved and how much benefit of the doubt he was allowed to keep once the question started. By the middle of the 1990s, both players had already won Most Valuable Player awards and were established as the best hitters on their respective teams. The clearest proof of Bagwell's own greatness came in the strike-shortened 1994 season. In only 110 games, he hit .368, slugged .750, and launched 39 home runs, numbers so complete that he was named Most Valuable Player unanimously, with every single voter putting him first. His wins above replacement, a stat that estimates how many extra wins a player adds compared to a readily available replacement player, was 8.2 that year, the best mark in the entire National League. Bonds finished that same season with 6.0 wins above replacement. An excellent number, but clearly behind Bagwell's historic peak. That matters for one simple reason. Bagwell was not judging Bonds from a distance, the way a fan or a writer might. He was one of the small number of players good enough to know the difference between being an excellent hitter and being Barry Bonds. When Bagwell praised what Bonds could do at the plate, he was speaking as a genuine peer, a man who had already proven he belonged in the same conversation about the greatest hitters of his time. Bagwell spoke about Bonds with a kind of admiration that went far beyond home runs. He kept coming back to one idea. Whatever people wanted to believe about Bonds' body, his greatest weapon was always his mind. mind. Hitting a major league fastball is one of the hardest things a human being can do. A batter has a fraction of a second to see the ball leave the pitcher's hand, read its spin and movement, guess what pitch is coming, and decide whether to swing, all before the ball has traveled halfway to the plate. Most hitters manage this by narrowing their focus and hoping their instincts are fast enough. Bagwell believed Bonds did something different. He believed Bonds had built an internal library of every pitcher he faced, so detailed that he could predict what was coming before it left the pitcher's hand. There is a story that captures this perfectly. Bonds would sometimes stand on first base after reaching there, and calmly tell teammates what pitch he expected to hit out of the park his next time up. Then he would go up and do exactly that. That is not the kind of thing a needle can create. A drug can help a muscle recover faster or add power to a swing that is already in motion, but it cannot teach a hitter to read a slider out of a pitcher's hand a half second sooner than everyone else on the field. Bagwell understood that distinction clearly, even while the rest of the sport was busy arguing about biceps and locker room rumors. The clearest evidence of that mental gift sits in one enormous number. Over his career, Bonds drew 2,558 walks, the most in the history of the sport. A walk happens when a hitter refuses to chase pitches outside the strike zone, forcing the pitcher to either throw a strike or send him to first base for free. Pitchers do not walk a hitter that many times because his body looks intimidating. They walk him because they have tried the alternative again and again and paid for it. Every one of those walks represents a pitcher deciding that letting Bonds stand on first was safer than letting him swing the bat. That is not muscle. That is fear, built on respect, earned pitch by pitch, season after season. Bagwell was careful never to claim that physical enhancement changed nothing. He was not naive about what was happening in clubhouses during that era, and he never pretended otherwise. His argument was more precise than that. Whatever assistance a player used, it could improve recovery time, add bat speed, or help a tired body bounce back for another 162-game season. What it could never do was manufacture the part of Bonds that mattered most. The part that let him stand in the batter's box and already know what was coming. That part of Bonds existed long before any transformation, and it remained the true engine behind everything he did at the plate. If you strip away every assumption about the era and just watch the swing decisions, the walk totals, and the pitch recognition, you are left with a hitter whose greatest advantage was never his size. It was that he so often seemed to know the future before the pitch even arrived. Long before anyone questioned his body, Bonds was already one of the most complete players the sport had seen in a generation. This is the part of the story that gets buried the most, because it happened years before the controversy, when nobody had a reason to look closely. In 1991, Bonds hit .292 with a .410 on-base percentage and a .514 slugging percentage. He hit 25 home runs, drove in 116 runs, stole 43 bases, and drew 107 walks. His wins above replacement that season was 8.0. That is not a home run hitter who got lucky. That is a player who could hit for average, hit for power, control the strike zone, run the bases aggressively, and still play strong defense in the outfield. Bagwell's own 1991 season was excellent in its own right. A .294 average with 15 home runs and 4.8 wins above replacement. The season of a player building towards stardom. Side by side, both men were already elite, multi-dimensional threats, years before anyone thought to ask hard questions about either of them. Move the comparison forward to that historic 1994 season, and the picture only gets clearer. Bagwell's unanimous MVP campaign was the best of the two, no question, but Bonds still put up a .312 average with a .647 slugging percentage, 37 home runs, and 6.0 wins above replacement in a season shortened by the strike. That is a genuine superstar season sitting quietly next to one of the greatest peaks in National League history. The fact that Bagwell's numbers were even better than Bonds's that year is exactly why Bagwell's later praise of him carries weight. He was not admiring Bonds from below, he was measuring him from the same level, as a fellow elite hitter who happened to be building something even bigger. By 1997, both men were putting together the kind of seasons that only a handful of players in baseball history ever manage. Bagwell hit 43 home runs and stole 31 bases that year, a rare combination of power and speed that very few first basemen have ever matched. Bonds matched him blow for blow, hitting 40 home runs while stealing 37 bases of his own, drawing 145 walks along the way. Both men were showing that they could impact a game in almost every way a hitter can, not just with power but with speed, patience, and instinct on the bases. If you only looked at the record book starting in 2001, you might think Bonds suddenly discovered greatness out of nowhere. The truth is the opposite. By 1997, Bonds was already among the most feared and complete hitters anywhere in the sport, 4 full years before the 73 home run season that made him famous to casual fans. That is the story most people never got because most people only started paying attention once the numbers became impossible to ignore. Bagwell had been watching all along, and he understood something the rest of the country missed. The player who exploded in the early 2000s was not a manufactured product appearing out of thin air. He was an already extraordinary athlete entering a new chapter, one shaped by a dramatic physical change after the 1998 season, a change that Bagwell, more than almost anyone else in the sport, was uniquely positioned to explain honestly. Bagwell had a simple, honest way of separating normal growth from something unusual, and it came directly from his own body. He explained that between the 1995 and 1996 off-seasons, when he was 27 years old, he added about 20 pounds of muscle. At that age, a player's body still has room to develop. Young athletes in their 20s are still building toward their physical peak, and a jump like that is not out of the ordinary. Bagwell drew a clear line between that kind of normal growth and something very different. An established veteran in his mid to late 30s, already past his physical peak, suddenly returning to spring training carrying 25 or 30 pounds of new muscle. That kind of change, he pointed out, does not happen naturally. It is a biological anomaly, and it deserves attention. That description lines up almost exactly with the transformation Bonds underwent after the 1998 season. He was entering his mid-30s, an age when most position players are already sliding down the back half of their careers, and instead he became the most dominant offensive force the sport had ever produced, eventually hitting 73 home runs in a single season. Bagwell never used that comparison to accuse anyone directly, and this video will not either. What can be said honestly is this: Bagwell saw the change as an obvious warning sign. The transformation fueled enormous public suspicion, and the surrounding research links this period directly to the wider steroid debate that eventually consumed the sport. The public believed it was watching something well outside the normal boundaries of aging, and Bagwell, better than almost anyone, understood exactly why. But Bagwell did not stop at describing the pattern. He went further than almost any player of his era by explaining why it happened in the first place, and this is where his honesty becomes uncomfortable for a lot of people. He openly admitted that if he had been a bubble player, someone fighting just to keep a spot on a major league roster, the money available in the game would have made the temptation almost impossible to resist. In his own words, all it takes is one big year, and suddenly a player is around for 5 or 6 more seasons. Think about what that actually means. One productive year can be the difference between a short career and a long one, between financial security for a family and an early trip back to the minor leagues or out of baseball altogether. That single idea shifts the entire conversation. Instead of asking why one famous slugger made a certain choice, Bagwell was asking why an entire industry built a system where that choice made obvious financial sense for hundreds of players. Consider carefully the landscape at the time. A great season could secure a player's future for years to come, turning a single hot summer into a decade-long career and a level of financial security few other jobs could ever offer. Every player was competing against teammates and opponents who might already be using every legal or illegal advantage available. Major League Baseball had no testing program and no meaningful penalties until 2004. Meaning an entire generation of players operated in a league with no rules against the very thing that later destroyed reputations. And the teams themselves, along with the league office, benefited enormously from the rising offensive numbers that filled stadiums and boosted television ratings. This is where Bagwell's position feels the most honest of anyone connected to that era. He never pretended that giving in to temptation was admirable. He simply explained, plainly and without excuses, why the temptation existed in the first place. His argument was never really about protecting one man's reputation. It was about pointing at the system that surrounded every player of that generation, a system that created enormous incentives to change your body, then turned around years later and pretended to be shocked when players actually did. It helps to remember that Bagwell was not speaking about this subject from a safe distance. His closest friend on the Astros was Ken Caminiti, the same third baseman whose old roster spot had pushed Bagwell over to first base years earlier. Caminiti's own story later became the center of a Sports Illustrated investigation that changed how the entire country talked about steroids in baseball, a story that showed just how close to home this issue actually was for Bagwell. He was not theorizing about strangers in other clubhouses. He was watching the pressures of the era play out inside his own circle of teammates and friends, which is exactly why his explanation of the financial incentives behind performance enhancement carries the weight of someone who saw the human cost up close, rather than someone repeating talking points from a safe seat in the broadcast booth. That closeness is part of what makes Bagwell's honesty so unusual for a player of his generation. Most athletes from that era, when asked about the subject at all, either denied everything or refused to engage with the question in any meaningful way. Bagwell did neither. He spoke plainly about his own supplement use. He spoke plainly about the pressures facing players fighting for a roster spot, and he spoke plainly about admiring a rival whose talent he considered close to unmatched, even while fully aware of the suspicion surrounding him. That kind of honesty rarely wins a player friends in the middle of a national controversy, and it did not make Bagwell popular with everyone who wanted a simpler villain to point at. But it is exactly the kind of honesty that tends to hold up well once enough time has passed for people to look at the full picture rather than the version that felt satisfying in the moment. To really see how far Bonds pulled away from the pack and how Bagwell was positioned to watch it happen from the closest possible seat, it helps to count down 5 seasons side by side, moving from the smallest gap between the two men to the widest gap in baseball history. Number 5. The 1991 season. Bagwell hit .294 with 15 home runs and 4.8 wins above replacement in his first full year. Bonds hit .292 with 25 home runs, 43 stolen bases, and 8.0 wins above replacement. Both were already excellent, but Bonds was already showing the kind of complete, 5-tool production that made him a different type of player entirely, years before anyone had a reason to be suspicious of anything. Number 4. The 1994 season, Bagwell's unanimous MVP year. He hit .368 with a .750 slugging percentage and 8.2 wins above replacement, the best mark in the National League. Bonds still turned in a .312 average, 37 home runs, and 6.0 wins above replacement. Bagwell was clearly the better player that season, and that is exactly the point. His praise for Bonds later in life came from a man who had already outproduced him at his absolute peak, not from someone hoping to justify his own choices by inflating a rival. Number 3. The 1997 season. Bagwell hit 43 home runs and stole 31 bases, a rare combination for any player, let alone a first baseman. Bonds matched him with 40 home runs, 37 stolen bases, and 9.8 wins above replacement, drawing 145 walks in the process. Both men were performing at a level that only a handful of players in baseball history ever reach, and the gap between them was still close enough to call them true peers. Number 2. The 2001 season. The year everything changed. Bagwell was still excellent, hitting .290 with 39 home runs and 130 runs batted in. But Bonds hit .328 with an .863 slugging percentage, 73 home runs, 177 walks, and 11.9 wins above replacement. What number means his presence in the lineup added nearly 12 extra wins compared to a readily available replacement player, an almost unheard of total for a single season. Bagwell had not fallen off. Bonds had simply stepped into a different statistical universe entirely. Number 1. The 2004 season, the widest gap of all. Bagwell, slowed by a shoulder that was breaking down after years of wear, hit .266 with 27 home runs and just 2.0 wins above replacement. Bonds, at age 40, posted a .362 average, a .812 slugging percentage, and a record .609 on-base percentage, meaning he reached base more than 6 times in every 10 trips to the plate. He drew 232 walks and still generated 10.6 wins above replacement. Across his 4-year run from 2001 through 2004, Bonds averaged roughly 10.5 wins above replacement per season, a level of production no other player in his late 30s has ever come close to matching. None of this proves that the controversy surrounding Bonds had no effect at all. That is not the argument. The argument is that Bonds' underlying talent was so far above the ordinary that even inside the same high offense environment that lifted dozens of other players, he still separated himself dramatically from the rest of the era's biggest stars, Bagwell included. The research behind this story makes clear that the whole period was saturated with performance-enhancing behavior across the sport, but it does not claim that every single player used banned substances, and neither does this video. What the numbers do show, clearly and repeatedly, is that Bagwell's admiration for Bonds was built on direct, season-by-season comparison between two genuine peers, not on friendship, nostalgia, or convenient loyalty. There is a reason this comparison matters more than a simple highlight reel of impressive numbers. Fans are usually taught to expect a fairly predictable aging curve from great hitters. A player rises through his 20s, peaks somewhere in his early 30s, and then gradually declines as his body slows down, his bat speed fades, and injuries pile up. Bagwell's own career followed almost exactly that pattern, rising to a peak in the mid-1990s before shoulder problems dragged his production down in his final seasons. Bonds broke that pattern completely, and Bagwell was one of the only people with the standing and the knowledge to explain why that broken pattern deserved a more careful explanation than simple outrage. He was not asking anyone to ignore how unusual the pattern was. He was asking people to understand the two separate forces behind it, the extraordinary baseline talent that had always been there, and the era's chemical assistance that helped extend and amplify a peak that had already been building since Bonds' very first seasons in the league. None of this happened in a vacuum, and this is the part of the story that gets left out the most. The idea of a clean, bright line separating legal preparation from illegal cheating did not really exist during this era. In practice, baseball operated inside a gray area, where players were often encouraged to use whatever legal supplements were available to help them compete and recover. In August 1998, a Houston Chronicle reporter named Alan Truex published a series of investigative articles looking into supplement use inside major league clubhouses. During that reporting, Jeff Bagwell did something very few players were willing to do. He openly admitted, without being cornered into it, that he used creatine and a supplement called androstenedione. He said it plainly, describing how it helped him build muscle and recover from the physical toll of a long season. At that time, androstenedione was a legal, over-the-counter product sold in ordinary nutrition stores across the country. Major League Baseball had not banned it, even though other sporting bodies, including the International Olympic Committee, already had. Because it was legal under the sport's own rules, Bagwell's honest admission barely caused a stir. Then, 2 weeks later, everything changed. An Associated Press reporter spotted a bottle of the same supplement in the locker of St. Louis slugger Mark McGwire, who was chasing one of the most famous records in the sport. Suddenly, a legal, over-the-counter product became a national controversy that eventually reached Congress. The supplement had not changed. The rules had not changed. What changed was the size of the record McGwire was chasing, and how much attention the country was suddenly paying. That contrast says everything about how quickly something ordinary and accepted could be turned into a scandal, depending entirely on who was using it and what was at stake. Step back and look at the bigger picture surrounding all of this. Baseball was recovering from serious damage caused by the 1994 players' strike, which had angered fans and shrunk attendance across the sport. The home run explosion of the late 1990s brought fans back in huge numbers, filled stadiums, and generated enormous revenue for everyone connected to the game. Coaches, general managers, and trainers had every incentive to encourage players to get bigger and stronger, because stronger players produced more home runs, and more home runs produced more money. Meaningful drug testing and real penalties did not arrive until 2004, years after the supplement boom had already reshaped the sport. It is worth asking a simple question. If the entire structure of the business rewarded exactly this kind of transformation for years, and the people running the sport looked the other way while cashing the checks, why should the individual players carry all of the blame while the executives who built and protected that system faced almost none of it? This was never simply a debate about a home run total or a muscular frame. It was a debate about a level of sustained production that broke the normal aging curve of the sport entirely, produced by a player who had already proven, over a decade earlier, that he belonged among the very best hitters in baseball. Bagwell saw that combination clearly, better than almost anyone else with a direct view of it, and he refused to let a simple, comfortable explanation replace a more complicated and more honest one. All of this eventually landed on the doorstep of the Baseball Hall of Fame, and the way voters handled it exposes exactly the kind of inconsistency Bagwell warned about. Since almost no player from this era had an actual positive drug test on record, voters could not rely on hard proof. Instead, they built their judgments on suspicion, public image, and how much a player was liked by the writers covering him. Look at what actually happened during the 2017 Hall of Fame vote. Jeff Bagwell was elected with 86.2% of the vote. Ivan Rodriguez was elected with 76.0%. Meanwhile, Barry Bonds received only 53.8%, and Roger Clemens received 54.1%, both well short of the 75% needed for induction. Now compare the actual evidence against each man. The case against Bagwell was built entirely on circumstantial pieces: his friendship with Ken Caminiti, his late career power, and his muscular frame, and he had openly admitted to using a substance that worked in much the same way as the anabolic steroids everyone was worried about. Rodriguez had been directly and publicly accused by a former teammate of steroid use and gave a famously evasive answer when asked directly whether he had ever used them. Bonds, for his part, never actually tested positive under baseball's official testing program either, since the positive results connected to his name were seized in a federal raid and later ruled inadmissible over serious problems with how the evidence was handled. So look at where that leaves things. Two players with real documented question marks were voted in with room to spare, while the two men with the most public suspicion attached to their names were kept out, despite nobody actually proving more against them than existed against the players who got elected. The difference was not the strength of the evidence. The difference was how each man was perceived. Voters extended enough benefit of the doubt to Bagwell and Rodriguez to look past what they knew, while Bonds, who had spent his whole career locked in a hostile relationship with the same writers who would eventually vote on his legacy, received none of that same grace. This video is not trying to attack Bagwell's election, and it should not be read that way. Bagwell earned his spot through a career that stands on its own, filled with genuine excellence built the hard way. But that is exactly what makes the treatment of Bonds so hard to justify under the voters' own logic. Go back to that image from the start of this video. A pitcher standing on the mound in 2001, staring in at Barry Bonds, and deciding that the safest pitch was no pitch at all. That moment did not happen because of a rumor. It happened because Bonds had spent more than a decade proving, swing after swing, walk after walk, that giving him anything to hit was a mistake. Jeff Bagwell watched that same story unfold from one of the best seats in the sport, as a genuine peer who had already reached the top of the game himself, and he refused to reduce it to a simple morality tale the way so many others did. Bagwell never asked anyone to pretend the era was clean. He never asked people to ignore the physical transformation, the suspicion it created, or the questions that followed Bonds for the rest of his career. What he asked for was something much harder to give in the middle of a national controversy. He asked people to understand what actually happened, instead of settling for the version of the story that felt the most satisfying to believe. Blaming one man is simple. Blaming an entire system that rewarded, encouraged, and profited from that exact behavior for over a decade is much harder, because it means admitting that almost everyone involved, not just the players, bears some responsibility for what the sport became. Pull the different threads of this story together and a clear picture emerges. Bonds was already one of the most complete and dangerous hitters in the sport years before anyone had a reason to be suspicious of him, putting up seasons in 1991 and 1997 that stand on their own without any asterisks attached. His greatest tool was never his size. It was a mind that read pitchers faster than they could adjust to him, the same mind that let him predict his own home runs standing on first base and back it up moments later. Baseball built a financial and institutional system that made performance enhancement almost inevitable for players fighting to stay on a roster, then waited over a decade to introduce any testing or consequences at all. When the sport finally had to reckon with what it had allowed, the Hall of Fame voters applied a standard that had far more to do with likability and public relationships than with the actual evidence sitting in front of them. And removing Barry Bonds from that conversation does not create a cleaner version of baseball history. It creates a less honest one, a history with a hole where its most dominant hitter should be. None of this means Bonds was flawless. and this video was never trying to make that case. His transformation raised real questions. His relationship with the media made him an easy target when the sport went looking for someone to blame. The controversy surrounding his career is real, and it is not being erased here. But none of that changes what Jeff Bagwell saw clearly, at a time when almost nobody else in the sport was willing to say it out loud. Bonds was not created by the era he played in. He arrived as an extraordinary talent, already excellent before anyone added a single pound of muscle, and the era simply turned him into its most extreme example. The player who took an already rare gift and pushed it further than the rules of the time ever expected anyone to go. There is also something worth saying about what this story teaches beyond baseball itself. Every generation produces its own version of this same argument. A gifted person operating inside a flawed system, judged harshly for choices that the system itself made easy, even attractive, while the people who built that system face far less scrutiny. Sports fans like clean, simple stories with a clear hero and a clear villain, because clean stories are easy to remember and easy to repeat. Real history rarely works that way. Bagwell understood that difference better than most people connected to the game, and he chose honesty over comfort at a time when comfort would have cost him nothing. Think about what a museum is actually supposed to do. The plaques in Cooperstown exist to preserve an honest record of the sport, not a comfortable one. A young fan walking through that hall years from now deserves to learn about the era that actually happened, including its most complicated and most dominant player, rather than a cleaned-up version with a convenient hole where the all-time home run leader should stand. Leaving Bonds out does not protect the sport's history. It edits it, quietly removing the parts that make people uncomfortable while leaving in every player whose story turned out to be easier to accept. That is really what Bagwell's honesty offers people today, long after both men have finished playing. It offers a way to hold two ideas at the same time without pretending one of them cancels out the other. The controversy was real, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But the greatness was real too, built years before any of it started, on a foundation of pitch recognition, patience, and instinct that no supplement in the world could manufacture. Most of the debate around Bonds has always demanded that fans pick one side of that story and ignore the other. Bagwell never did that, and this video has tried not to either. That is the story baseball spent years refusing to tell honestly, and it is the story Jeff Bagwell was telling all along, back when almost nobody wanted to listen. Controversy can change the way people remember a player. It can attach an asterisk to a record, keep a plaque out of Cooperstown, and shape an entire generation's opinion of a man before he ever gets a fair hearing. What it cannot do is rewrite what actually happened on the field, season after season, at bat after at bat. Jeff Bagwell knew that the day would come when the numbers would speak louder than the noise around them. He was right about Barry Bonds long before baseball was fully ready to admit it, and the record he pointed to the entire time has never once changed.